All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everybody's signed in at this point. I am Rob Rowan, the chair of World Affairs Council Upstate. I'm here to welcome you all to today's webinar. First, a little bit about World Affairs Council Upstate. We're dedicated to bringing you educational opportunities like today's to explore the issues around the world, whether they're business or they're pandemic or whatever it is. We try to find the best experts to share their point of view. And World Affairs Council Upstate is part of the Upstate International, which I think you should visit upstateinternational.org, because you'll find out what we're doing, as well as all the cultural events that we do. But also, interesting enough, we have language classes in many, many languages and the best language teachers. So I want to thank Upstate Business Journal for hosting this and being our sponsor this year. And I want to also ask everybody to take this moment and make sure you shut off your sound and your video, so we will not be distracted with that. So let me introduce today. I get to do two things. So I'm going to introduce today our main speaker, Ambassador Robert Blake. He has served for 31 years in the State Department in a wide range of leadership positions. And I'm just going to highlight a few of his many posts. From 2006 to 2009, he served concurrently as U.S. Ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Prior to that, he had served as Deputy Chief of Mission in India from 2003 to 2006, where he was named the Worldwide Deputy Chief of Mission of the Year by the State Department. That was pretty good. In 2009, he was nominated by President Obama to be the Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. And he served there from 2009 to 2013, which again, he was awarded the State Department Distinguished Service Award. Most recently, from 2013 to 2016, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, where he focused on building stronger business and educational ties between the U.S. and Indonesia, while also developing cooperation to help Indonesia reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He is currently chairman of the board of the U.S.-Indonesia Society, a member of the board of the Asian Foundation and the Bhutan Foundation. He's currently the senior director for McLarty Associates in Washington, D.C., which, if you haven't heard about it, you should know. It's made up of ambassadors, trade negotiators, White House officials, journalists, intelligence officers, business leaders, and scholars, which helps clients navigate the strategic and operational challenges they face around the globe. And that makes him a fitting person to be talking about what we're doing. Along with Ambassador Blake, we have our moderator today, and you may remember William Lasser. Professor Lasser is a distinguished professor of political science at Clemson University and the director of Clemson's Honors College. He received his PhD in political science from Harvard University, and he is the author of numerous books and articles on law and American politics. He has taught courses in constitutional law, American government, and political theory at Clemson for more than 35 years, and in 1993 was a recipient of Clemson's Master Teacher Award. So at this point, let me say thank you both for being here and doing this with us, and I will pass it on to William Lasser, and let's enjoy this.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Ambassador Blake, for being with us today. We're all looking forward to this conversation, lecture, and then conversation, Q&A on the global supply chains. I just want to reiterate Rob's suggestion. Please put your phone or your sound on mute and turn your video off so it improves the flow of information back and forth technologically. And as far as the questions go, please use the chat feature, and I'll be monitoring that and relaying the questions to Ambassador Blake. If you think of a question while he's speaking, go ahead and post it, because I'll keep track of that and then you won't forget. But we're really counting on you to ask some great questions and to lead the second part of this presentation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Blake, who will speak on the dynamics of today's supply chains with Southeast Asia.
Terrific. Well, first of all, thanks to you, Rob, for your kind invitation. It's really great to be with you and all of your listeners, and greetings as well to Professor Bill Lasser. And I just wish I could be in lovely South Carolina with all of you. And Maybe when the COVID situation improves, and if I do a good enough job, you'll invite me back. So, but as Rob mentioned, I've been working for the last several years on Southeast Asia, and both as an ambassador, but also in the business community. And one emerging opportunity that we've been talking about with U.S. companies in the region is that those companies are looking to diversify and improve the resilience of their supply chains. So I'll get into a little bit what that all means. But today I thought I would share some thoughts about these global supply chains, why China has been so important in this area, what has changed to cause companies to now seek to diversify, and then last, where they're going, with a little bit of about what we could expect either from a second Trump administration or from Joe Biden if he's elected. So let me just dive right in. As many of you know, for years, the US and other companies have leveraged the process of globalization to develop global supply chains that help them to minimize production, logistics, and other costs. And China was really a great beneficiary of this process because China combined relatively skilled labor, relatively low wages, excellent infrastructure, pretty impressive investment incentives, and a capacity to group suppliers close to each other. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, if you were a textile company, you would not only have your textile factory, but you would probably be grouped next to other factories that produce the elastics and the buttons and everything. So everything is all grouped right together like that. And the Chinese really did a terrific job of that. So what has changed to kind of disrupt that model a little bit? I think really two factors have induced US and other companies to rethink their reliance on China. The first is the US-China trade war, and the second is the COVID-19 situation. So let me just briefly describe each of those, starting with the trade war. As many of you know, even before the COVID-19 crisis struck, US tariffs on imports from China had been going up steadily and were already at their highest rates since 1993. So that, for an American company that was seeking to re-export back into the United States market, they were facing a pretty high tariffs that was, making it very difficult for them to compete. So that caused them to start to look to diversify and not become collateral damage in this escalating trade war between the United States and China. The other big factor that was forcing a rethink was COVID-19 itself. You will recall that when things really started to hit in February, much of global production had to shut down when China shut down. By some estimates, up to 3/4 of US businesses suffered supply chain disruptions in February because of the shutdown in China. That gives you a sense of the reliance that companies had on the Chinese market and on production in China. I'll give you a few examples. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, one of the first things the Chinese government did was to block all exports of masks. So, for example, 3M has a big Chinese factory that was producing masks. 3M was prevented from exporting any of those masks so that the Chinese market could be satisfied. So that, of course, caused a huge supply chain disruption for that company. Then in March, as things were improving in China, COVID started to hit other countries around the region and, of course, around the world. And that caused many countries to impose export restrictions of their own. particularly on medical equipment and on food. So to take one example in the food area, Vietnam, a major exporter of rice, imposed restrictions on rice exports to make sure that they would be able to feed their people. So all of this led US and other companies to understand that it's really not very smart to put all of your manufacturing in one country, and that it was very much in their interest to diversify, and in some cases even to onshore, that is, bring production back to the United States, and that all of that would be quite a smart strategy. So let's just look briefly at the onshoring question, because I think that's interesting. As all of you know, President Trump, since the beginning of his administration, has been doing everything he could to try to pressure US companies to bring manufacturing back to the United States and to bring back, of course, the jobs that they represent. Another previous trend that was accelerated by COVID-19 was the development of automation and robotics. Of course, robotics are wonderful right now in this time when we don't want to be touching too many surfaces and things like that. So again, that's an accelerating trend that we're seeing. And Congress joined the party as well. So they've been talking about various significant funds to try to incentivize companies to leave China and come back to the United States, and again, bring some or all of these supply chains back to the United States. Now, I have to say there's a limit to how much reshoring you're going to see, for two reasons. One is that companies have operations where their big markets are. So China is obviously the largest market in the world for many, many products. And there's great pressure on the part of the Chinese and others, companies like Indonesia, where I served, a country of 270 million people. They do a lot to try to force foreign companies to produce in those markets, and often actually condition the ability to sell into those markets on establishing some sort of production facility. And then, of course, so there's a lot of pressure on these companies, both to be close to those markets, but also to manufacture locally. So one of the companies that does a lot of good work on this is the consulting firm A.T. Kearney. And for years, they've been publishing what they call a reshoring index. And so their most recent index showed a reversal of a long trend where now, domestic US manufacturing in 2019 really started to increase, particularly with respect to 14 Asian low-cost countries that they track. So those countries are countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. This year's report was interesting because they also started to do what they call the diversification index, which tried to track the rebalancing of US manufacturing imports from Asia and track specifically who was leaving China and where were they going. And the study found that that US manufacturing imports from these Asian low-cost producers, other than China, increased by about 31 billion in 2019 in various product categories. And of that 31 billion, about 46% of that came out of Vietnam. So Vietnam was sort of the big beneficiary of a movement out of China to other countries. And Vietnam exported roughly $14 billion in additional manufactured goods to the United States in 2019 versus 2018. Now, as always with all of these numbers, you have to be a little bit cautious. One of the things that you have to be aware of is that not all of these gains represent a true relocation of production from China to Vietnam. Chinese producers often practice what is called transshipment, where in order to avoid tariffs in the United States, they will ship goods to Vietnam and do a very small bit of modification to those, a little bit of value added. And then those can then be relabeled as Vietnamese products, and they won't be then subject to the high China tariffs. So there's quite a lot of that's been going on. So for example, in the electronics industry, shipments of electronics from China to Vietnam in 2018, from 2018 to 2019, grew very, very substantially. And Vietnamese electronics exports to the US grew 72%. So a huge increase. Whereas exports to the rest of the world only grew 13%. So that shows that a lot of that increase is basically Chinese electronics being repurposed, and again, this sort of slight value added in Vietnam, and then relabeled as Vietnamese exports. Anyway, to go back to where these companies relocated to, the Kearney study showed that 46% went to Vietnam, another 27% went to Taiwan, 10% to India, 5% to Thailand, and 4% to Malaysia, and then a large number of smaller increments to various countries. And this year, Kearney is forecasting that companies are going to continue to rethink these sourcing strategies and move these supply chains to increase their resilience and spread their risks. I thought you all might be interested to just understand a little bit why these companies are moving to places like Vietnam. So I thought I'd just briefly describe some of the opportunities and some of the risks in some of these big Southeast Asian countries. And let me just start with Vietnam, because again, that has been the beneficiary of a lot of this shift. There's a lot of US and multinational manufacturing that goes on in Vietnam. Let's take electronics again. Samsung just last week announced its intention to move all of its personal computing production from China to Vietnam to cut costs and to remain competitive. Likewise, you see big corporations like Intel have big chip manufacturing operations in Vietnam. In apparel, you have Nike, Columbia, Walmart, Target, all either sourced from or actually have factories in Vietnam. Pharmaceutical companies likewise. And why are they all there? They're there, first of all, because Vietnam has the highest growth rates of any of the ASEAN countries. When I say ASEAN, ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So 10 different Southeast Asian nations that have formed their aim is eventually to have a complete common market. They're not yet there yet, but they have managed to significantly reduce tariffs between them. And so it's now quite an interesting and important market for American companies. So Vietnam is the highest growth economy in ASEAN. And unlike a lot of the other ASEAN countries, Vietnam managed the COVID challenge quite well. So most analysts project that the Vietnamese economy is actually going to grow in 2020, which is quite unusual, and virtually none of Vietnam's neighbors are in that same category. Almost all of them are going to experience fairly significant drops in their economy in 2019, and then most likely recover in 2020. Another factor for Vietnam that kind of distinguishes it from others is that they have been very good about negotiating free trade agreements. So they were one of the original members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now its successor, what's called CPTPP. But they also recently concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union, and with several other countries. So that means that if you produce in Vietnam, you enjoy those free trade benefits, can re-export to CPTPP countries, to EU countries, and so forth. And that's a pretty big advantage. On the weakness side, you know, Vietnam is still a relatively complex place to do business. The World Bank has ease of doing business index, where they chart a lot of the important factors for doing business. And so Vietnam ranks a relatively low 60 on that. So there are 59 countries that are easier to do business in than that. Likewise, they're number 96 in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, so about halfway down the list. Their worker skills are relatively low level. They have low wages, but the skills are not so great either, so that's sort of an issue. But in general, Vietnam is a low wage place. They have these free trade agreements, and again, they have very high growth rates. So it's been a very attractive place. A second country that I think has been quite interesting for American companies has been Thailand. So you see, for example, the automotive industries, Ford, General Motors, BMW, all of the major Japanese automotive companies all have very large assembly and manufacturing plants in Thailand. Likewise, the electronics, just as in Vietnam, so Samsung and Toshiba and Panasonic, food and beverage, biotechnology. So quite a wide range of manufacturing that goes on there. And Thailand's strengths are that it's the second largest market in ASEAN after Indonesia, but they have a good ease of doing business score. They come in just after Singapore and Malaysia. They're geographically well positioned. They're right in the middle between Cambodia and Laos, Malaysia and Vietnam. They have a very good infrastructure. And like Vietnam, they've done well in dealing with the COVID-19 situation. So they're expected to recover fairly quickly. On the less positive, from American company perspectives, is that Thailand has among the highest wages among at least the attractive ASEAN countries. So they don't have as competitive a wage rate as, for example, Vietnam. There's still a lot of political uncertainty in Thailand. There's been a military ruler was elected president, but it's still not a real democracy yet. So there's worries about that. There have been, many of you have seen some recent demonstrations that have been going on over the last week there to move faster on the democracy front. And again, they have mixed levels of education. So you have in some parts of the country, relatively unskilled and not terribly well educated labor force, which increases training costs for American companies. But nonetheless, Thailand is probably the second most attractive after Vietnam. A third is Malaysia. And Malaysia, again, has really done extremely well in the electronics industry in particular. The island of Penang, that is probably well known to many of you, is they have a concentration of these electronics companies. So Intel and Dell and various semiconductor companies are all located there. Also aerospace. So big companies like Honeywell have located to Malaysia. It's an interesting place because it's, again, quite a rich country. They have a high per capita GDP, so it's a good market. They are very good, very high rank on the ease of doing business, second only to Singapore. They've really made an effort to try to make it as easy as possible for people to manufacture there. So they've done well in that area. On the again, in terms of weaknesses, One of them is, of course, their wages are higher, and they have a relatively small pool of labor. Population is just north of 30 million people, and so they often have to import labor from other countries, and you have a fairly substantial problem of undocumented labor. So people coming in from other poorer parts of Southeast Asia, places like Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia, and even Indonesia. And as a result of that, there are fairly substantial risks associated with trafficking in persons, where undocumented workers have their whatever travel documents they have confiscated. The employers then will force them to pay back any transportation costs, and oftentimes they're not paid very well, and they end up in a form of bonded servitude for years and years and years. So it's become a huge issue. And Malaysia this year risks being put onto the lowest level, the lowest tier in terms of ranking on the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Index. So that's a fairly substantial risk for American and other companies that they're very aware of. Lastly, let me just talk a little bit about Indonesia, because it's got its own peculiarities. Again, like a lot of these other companies, they've attracted investments from big companies in the electronics sector, particularly from Korean companies, Samsung and LG. They have Indonesia, of course, because of its huge market, there's a very large middle class. So for consumer goods, you see, companies like Nike, like SC Johnson, like L'Oreal, Procter & Gamble just set up a big diaper production factory in Indonesia. So a lot of companies producing for the domestic market in Indonesia. And their strengths are just what I said. They have the largest internal market in ASEAN, and they're projected to continue to grow because they've got a relatively young population, a growing middle class, and various projections show that if current trends continue, they will become the fourth largest economy in the world by 2050, after only China, India, and the United States. So a lot of upside to investing in Indonesia. They traditionally relied on commodity exports. Indonesia is incredibly rich in just about every commodity that you can think of, from various kinds of metals to palm oil to tin and rubber and everything else. But those are unpredictable, and prices go up and down, and there's tariff wars, and all kinds of issues. So President Jokowi, the current president, decided that it would be in Indonesia's interest to diversify their sources of growth. And they've done a pretty good job. They have now the fastest growing digital economy in Southeast Asia. They've managed to attract a lot of new tourism, particularly from China. And they've made a real push on trying to improve infrastructure that has helped to reduce logistics costs and make manufacturing more competitive. And also, unlike Thailand and Vietnam, they have a relatively strong democracy with mostly accountable institutions, with the possible exception of the legal system, which is still known to be a little bit corrupt. So, Indonesia, on the less positive side, it's still a very complicated place to do business. They've got a lot of regulations. They have labor market issues. It's hard to fire people. You have to pay several years of severance pay if you want to fire somebody, which is a huge barrier to firing people. Like a lot of these countries, they have growing local content requirements, so that you've got to produce a certain amount of what you sell inside the country, which is often difficult. And many of their raw materials come from China, so there's that potential supply chain disruption. So I think that gives you a sense of some of the factors that US and Japanese and Korean and other companies are weighing. One question we often get asked, particularly from companies that are based in China, is whether they should expect blowback from China if they relocate some parts of their supply chain out of China to, let's say, Southeast Asia? And the answer we tell them is no, for a few reasons. First of all, China is itself moving up the value chain in terms of manufacturing. So, since wages and other costs are now higher in labor-intensive manufactured goods like textiles and footwear, it's no longer that profitable to manufacture those in China. And so people are moving to places like India and Bangladesh and Vietnam, where costs are lower and you're going to be more competitive. And indeed, Chinese companies themselves that produce textiles and things like that are moving out of China for that reason. Second, and I saw this when I was ambassador in Indonesia, there's a real competition now for influence in Southeast Asia. There's a recognition that the ASEAN market as a whole is going to be a growing market for the foreseeable future. So all of the countries, particularly China, the United States, and to a lesser extent Japan and South Korea, are looking to position themselves and for the future in Southeast Asia, and they're trying to, curry favor with all of these governments. So they are not likely, the Chinese are not likely to object to some of the manufacturing moving out of China. And we've seen the Chinese really pouring money into infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia through their famous Belt and Road Initiative. And, again, additional investment by companies would certainly be consistent with that and with that effort by China to help grow the economies of Southeast Asia. So the short answer is we don't fully believe that there would be much of a blowback. And so far there hasn't been. Now, all of that said, and let me just conclude my remarks on this note, we think that China's, even though some of the supply chains are moving out of China, China, without a doubt, is going to continue to be very, very important. For the last many, many years, China has had a roughly 25% share of global manufacturing capacity. And as I noted in the beginning of my talk, they succeeded by providing good investment incentives, grouping suppliers close to each other, providing skilled workers, good infrastructure, et cetera. And even to this day, few other countries can match that combination that the Chinese are able to provide. And yes, wages and other costs are increasing in China, but the Chinese themselves are compensating for that by increasing automation and also by increasing their incentives. They have very, very high unemployment among their migrant workers, particularly those who are coming from the western parts of China. And so they are very anxious to continue to provide employment for all those workers because they don't want to have any kind of domestic unrest. So our China team really expects the government to continue to try to incentivize foreign companies to invest in China to employ these workers and basically offset some of the higher wage and other costs that companies are experiencing. And then, of course, as I said earlier, if you want to supply and sell to China's own large market, it's really essential that you produce at least some of what you want to sell in China itself. Nevertheless, we do expect countries and companies to try to avoid future supply chain disruptions, and so they are going to try to build in redundancies into their supply chains, so they're no longer dependent on one single supplier in China, for example. Let me just make a brief comment about our elections too, because that could have quite a significant impact. If President Trump is reelected, I think you can expect him to continue the trend of economic nationalism and onshoring and, again, pressuring US companies to come home, even though that probably will result in reduced efficiency and higher costs for US consumers. Joe Biden has been a little bit careful about this. He also has said that he wants to boost US production. Many of you have seen that he's proposed spending $400 billion with a B on what he calls a Buy America initiative, that would be designed to boost domestic production and build greater resilience into critical supply chains. And he's also called for what he calls fundamental reforms that would shift production of a range of critical products from China and other countries back to US soil. So things like semiconductors and things like that, they want to be sure that we always have a good supply inside our own country, so we're not vulnerable to supply disruptions. I think, unlike President Trump, one of the areas where you can expect Biden, if he's elected, to do more is to work more closely with our Pacific trading allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, to try to apply pressure on the Chinese on issues like the theft of intellectual property. Everybody is affected by that. Everybody agrees with that. And, the Trump administration has really sort of pursued a go-it-alone policy on this and hasn't really sought to work with these other countries and, of course, the EU as well. So I think you'd expect, if Biden's elected, you would expect him to do much more coordination with these and probably get a lot further in terms of some progress on these issues. Let me stop there. I hope I haven't run too much over my time limit. And I'd be happy to ask questions. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but feel free to ask about sort of overall policy in Asia and supply chains or whatever's on your mind. So again, thank you all so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. And again, please put your questions in the chat and we will get to those in just a second. I'd like to follow up, if I can, with this process that you've described as a kind of game of almost musical chairs, right? We're starting in one country, China, and then China moves up the supply chain ladder, and then moves to Vietnam. And I've even read Africa now, Ethiopia, for example, lots of movement in that direction. And as I was sort of reading some stuff in preparation for this, I came across one analyst who said we're kind of running out of magic countries. So I guess a question looking ahead, like, does that ever come, the music ever come to an end? And then what happens sort of, is that in the foreseeable future, or do you think that we don't have to worry about that for a long time in terms of continuing to find these low cost countries to move to?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the countries I was responsible for when I was Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia, so I was essentially overseeing the ambassadors in all of those countries and the policy in those countries. One of those countries was Bangladesh. And so Bangladesh was sort of the low-cost producer of textiles, and even in some cases undercutting Chinese prices. So if you wanted to make, for example, bulk white T-shirts, most of that was being done in Bangladesh. But if you needed to make bras or undergarments or things that required a little bit more work on them, and also required, were subject to changes in tastes in the market, then you wouldn't go to Bangladesh because they wouldn't have the flexibility and the trained labor to be able to change their production lines quickly enough. And so that's where companies, in places like Vietnam, really sort of owned those markets and did quite well. So I think, yeah, you're going to continue to see an evolution into these low-cost markets. And companies will track very closely where the wages are. A lot of it also, one of the things I learned, Bill, as ambassador, is companies go where the tariff advantages are. When I was ambassador in Sri Lanka, they have a very successful garment export industry. And they have very successfully leveraged American tariff policy. So they have, for example, put factories in Haiti. Why? Because Haiti enjoys duty-free exports into the U.S. market. Why? Because the U.S. Congress is worried about boat people coming from Haiti, and they want to stop illegal immigration. So the best way to do that is to create good paying jobs in Haiti itself. So they created these special incentives. So you find, the sort of odd situation where you have Sri Lankan companies investing, and many other companies, by the way, investing to take advantage of those. Likewise, for a while there, tiny little island of the Maldives, and where I was also responsible for a brief time, they had duty-free access into the United States market. So people from all over the world located there to take advantage of that. So it's both a factor of low wages, but also where you're going to find the lowest tariffs.
So interestingly, because the free trade agreements that are being used as sort of a means of competition with people obviously outside of those free trade agreements.
Yeah.
We have a question about the Trump policies. Broadly speaking, do you think the Trump tariff war was successful from a U.S. business point of view? From the point of view of U.S. business interests, I should say.
Not really. I think most people believe that it hasn't really achieved its objectives, and in fact, it's had the opposite impact of. Well, we've lost a lot of markets in China, in agricultural goods and many other goods, and we've gone about this in a strange way. We've often felt that our China policy really needs to if you really want to be successful, first of all, you need to work more closely with our allies, and I talked about that earlier. We need to work with like-minded countries like the EU, like South Korea, like Japan, and with multilateral institutions as well, like the WTO, and leverage those. Another thing that we need to do if we're going to really make ourselves competitive with China is that we need to do much more in terms of increasing federal government spending on things like basic research, modernizing our own infrastructure. And I think another really important component is immigration, and particularly allowing the most talented people in the world to come and stay here. And obviously the Trump administration has made a big effort to stop virtually all immigration, but including these very well-educated people. So, when you hear people like Bill Gates and really much of the tech community, they are all in favor of allowing much greater use of various kinds of high-tech visas called H-1B visas. And they're also in favor of making citizenship available. So if you have students from other countries who are studying any of the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and they get degrees and advanced degrees in those areas, they believe, and I agree with them, that we should make it easier for those people to stay in the United States and eventually become citizens. And there's overwhelming evidence that they will go on to start new businesses and create massive new investment and massive new employment opportunities for people. Just to give you one example, I was in charge of India for many years, and we used to say that 1/6 of the companies in Silicon Valley were started by Indian Americans, all of whom were originally either first or second generation immigrants from India. So that's a very good example of how immigrants just make a huge difference and really bring innovation and skills and things that we really need to create jobs in our country. So I think again we've gone about this in a kind of strange way, and we've ended up hurting our companies rather than helping them. Now, the Trump administration would argue, well, give the strategy a chance. We're still kind of halfway through it, and eventually China will come around. I don't know. I think that's a debatable proposition myself, because the Chinese will just dig in, and they've shown that they're quite capable of enacting reciprocal tariffs and other kinds of measures whenever we do something. I think another problem right now, of course, is that we're right in the middle of an election cycle, and in any U.S. election, you know, both Republicans and Democrats sort of vie with each other about who can be tougher on China, and we're seeing that here as well. And so Biden has to be super careful not to be seen as making concessions on China, because that would be something that the Trump administration would seek to leverage and hype in the debates and so forth.
You know, I don't want to get too specific in terms of the partisan issues, but just hypothetically, if a new administration were to come in and want to reverse this whole wide range of policies that you just described, so we're going to start cooperating more with allies, and we're going to lower the pressure in terms of a trade war on China, and we're going to change our immigration policy. You've worked in the State Department, very high levels. How hard is it to turn the ocean liner around? And what's involved with sort of just, you can't just turn a switch, I assume, and say, okay, now we're going to start, you know, doing everything a different way.
Yeah.
Have you experienced
absolutely.
anything?
It's not easy at all. And you know, what you need is, first of all, you've got to develop a strategy. And very, very importantly, we work with Congress. You've got to work hand in hand with Congress. So a very important piece of this would be what's going to happen in terms of both the House and the Senate, and whether the Democrats will be able to turn the Senate or not. As a matter of fact, I think there are quite a number of interesting efforts underway by various people on the Republican side to try to, you know, think through how do we make ourselves more competitive. So, for example, Chuck Schumer, who's the Senate majority, the minority leader on the Democratic side, and Senator Josh Young, a Republican, have proposed something called the Endless Frontier Act, which is $100 billion to fund research in 10 core technologies to ensure the future competitiveness of the U.S. economy. Marco Rubio, another thoughtful Republican, has been thinking about how to put more equity investments into small and mid-sized manufacturing, and how do we, make that more competitive, and how do we help them to export more. And then, of course, Biden has his own plans to really invest in breakthrough technologies. That's traditionally why the United States has always been the leading innovator in the world, but we've fallen away from that in recent years, and we've fallen away from science-based research and so forth. And so I think there's a consensus, at least in the Democratic side, and even among many Republicans, as I said, that we need to get back to that if we're going to really keep up with the Chinese on these issues. The Chinese have very, very elaborate make in China policies, and they've put very, very serious financing behind that. And so on a lot of these high technology issues now, and technologies, the Chinese are equal, or even in some cases exceed what is going on in the United States itself. So so we need to really take this seriously, and so I'm glad that there's thoughtful work going on both sides of the aisle. And any new strategy would have to involve both houses of Congress, and would have to evaluate what can pass through the U.S. Congress and actually become law. And so the election will be an important test of that.
Your comments about increasing our research infrastructure ties in with a question someone in the audience asked. What explains why immigrants from India coming to the United States did so well in the high-tech area? Are there lessons to be learned there?
Yeah. Well, India, it's interesting. The Indian American diaspora, the Indian American community in the United States, is among the most successful of all of the immigrant communities in America. So if you look at, for example, per capita income of immigrant communities, the Indians traditionally have ranked the highest. And why is that? Mostly it's because many of them came in the 70s and 80s and early 90s when India had a really largely import substituting economy. And India was going through what we call the Hindu rate of growth. So, you know, the economy was growing at about 3% a year, was not a very dynamic place. And again, sort of import substitution, very inefficient. And so a lot of the smartest Indians in the world decided to go to the United States and get their education in the United States. And then they took a hard look at opportunities and they said, you know, we're going to do a lot better in America than we are in our own country, because in America, there are really opportunities to do well. And it's a country where it really doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. And I remember once I asked a friend of mine who was a very smart Indian who lived in the United States for many years. And even I was there at a time when the second Bush administration, after we'd invaded Iraq, and it was a very unpopular move around the world. And really the only country that showed any support for our efforts was India. And the reason for that was, and I asked my friend, I said, why is that? Why are Indians sort of bucking the trend? He said, it's very simple. He said, you know, every single Indian has got a relative who's done well in the United States. And they appreciate the fact that it truly is an opportunity society. And that, you know, if you're an Indian and you're walking down the streets of, you know, Davenport, Iowa, or some place that doesn't see a lot of foreigners, as long as you speak English, the chances are that the average person from Davenport, Iowa, is going to think you're an American, is going to treat you like an American. Whereas if you're that same Indian and they're in Stuttgart or they're in Lyon in France, chances are that the average German or the average French person or the average Brit is going to assume they're a foreigner and is going to treat them as sort of a second-class citizen and sort of look down on them. So that was a really interesting comment, and it really kind of stuck with me. But the main answer to your question is America was just this huge opportunity, and we were able to attract the best and brightest of India. So they came and they went to the best American schools and became the doctors and lawyers and engineers and innovators of a lot of our economy, and you see that to this day.
There've been a lot of articles recently that, and this may be exaggerated. I guess that's my question, is whether you think it's accurate to say that around the world, people are not thinking of the United States that way anymore. Looking at Black Lives Matter protests and the police brutality and the kinds of racist comments that have been made by government officials, including the president. So do you think well, I guess two-part question is, have we lost that sort of image abroad? And if so, can we get it back easily, or is it too late?
I don't think it's too late, but without a doubt, we've lost influence because, you know, first of all, we don't spend as much time anymore talking about human rights and democracy and so forth. I mean, that used to be, for years and years when I was a diplomat, that was a core policy of ours, whether it was a Republican or a Democratic administration. And the Trump administration really hasn't practiced that. On the contrary, President Trump himself has you know, cozied up to a lot of dictators around the world, and so I think so we've lost a lot of credibility around the world as a result of that. But I don't think it's by any means a lost cause. I mean, I think if a new administration were to come in, that we would be able to, I think, restore our credibility. And certainly people that I know who work for the Biden administration are making very, very detailed plans about that. And I tell friends in places like Indonesia and Sri Lanka and places like that where I've served, you know, if Biden's elected, you can expect to see a much greater return and much greater emphasis on democracy and religious freedom and human rights and so forth. And you can expect the United States to return to try to lead some of these big international institutions that we've pulled out of, like the UN Human Rights Council and others, where like on climate change, where again, I think if Biden's elected, we'll see a much more expansive and aggressive approach to climate change. And all of those things would, I think, restore our credibility. But, it'll take a while, and people will always be wary of, is this only going to be a one-time term thing, and then we might see another, administration that might try to reverse this. So I think there has been some damage, but it's not irreparable.
Ties into a question that we have from regarding Hong Kong, and whether maybe we could talk generally about the crisis in Hong Kong, and then the specific question is, will this be a significant loss for international business in Hong Kong and for China because of the crackdowns in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think the Chinese themselves have to be a little bit careful about what's going on in China. They don't want to see a mass exodus from Hong Kong. And so far, American companies are kind of taking a wait and see approach, in part also because they want to see what happens in our own elections and what approach, if Biden's elected, what approach he will take on this. And I'm not aware if he said anything about the Hong Kong situation. But the other, but that said, I think, for example, Singapore, for many, many years, Singapore has been a rival financial center to Hong Kong. And now you are seeing companies build up a little bit their operations in Singapore. They're not entirely pulling out of Hong Kong, but there has been a trend there. And that's been something that we've been talking to various financial sector companies about. So far, again, no one's really willing yet to pull the trigger and pull out of Hong Kong, but they're definitely making inquiries and kind of thinking about it. So it's something that we're going to have to watch closely, but I don't expect that there would be immediate moves until after the election, and people can sort of sort out what the impact of the elections will be. And but there's no question that this is a part of a much longer authoritarian trend that is taking place in China. And I think one of the things that your listeners would be interested in is that, for years and years and years, really dating back to the Clinton administration, Democrats and Republicans made the strategic bet that if we allowed China into global institutions like the World Trade Organization and gave them a greater role in the UN and gave them a greater role in the World Bank and all of these international institutions, that as their economy developed, as their middle class developed, that China would become more like us. They would become more democratic, that their economy would become more market-oriented. And that simply has not happened, much to the surprise and I would say dismay of a lot of those experts. And so that's why you see this sort of growing consensus, even among Democrats, that we have to be tougher on China, and that there is this authoritarian trend, and that they're doubling down on their own models of again, both the authoritarian governance model, but also state control of the economy. And so China is not going to be changing any of these policies anytime soon. On the contrary, President Xi believes that their model is the right one to promote, and they're busily doing that around the world in countries, like Indonesia, where I served, and they're selling their surveillance technology to help countries to surveil their populations, as the Chinese themselves do. And there's a lot of concerns about those kinds of policies. So China, getting China to reverse the Hong Kong, what they've been doing in Hong Kong is not going to be an easy task by any means.
I think there was an assumption too that the freer flow of information from the internet would have a major effect
Absolutely.
on that process, and they've pretty much managed to.
They shut down the internet.
Shut that down.
Much harder.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I'm a political scientist, so let me talk about politics a little bit, not domestic politics, but you talk about the different countries. You went through Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, Indonesia, and the different factors that companies would look to. And a lot of the people in the audience are from the corporate sector and have an interest in this from that side. But I'm interested how a company, or how you would recommend that a company kind of weigh these political factors that you mentioned, trafficking or authoritarianism or protests or loss of democracy on the one hand, sort of against these sort of much more quantifiable economic factors of market share or consumer ease of doing business, these things which we can at least kind of get a handle on in a business sense. How do you then, so we've got a really good on that side, but it's a country that's kind of authoritarian or a country that has some traffic. How do you weigh that if you were advising a company?
What companies everywhere want is predictability. If they're going to make a big investment in any of these countries, you know, they want to be able to be sure that 15 or 20 years from now, they're going to continue to be able to amortize that investment and you know, continue to draw profits from that investment. So they want a predictable environment, and that includes a predictable political environment. You know, generally speaking, American companies and certainly foreign companies shy away from politics, but they do have to factor in things like trafficking of persons, let's say, or instability in Thailand. You know, if suddenly there's going to be if the young people get sufficiently angry that they're going to actually overthrow the government, that's of course going to cause massive instability, and it's not good for business. So they have to weigh all of those concerns, and that's why, you know, that's why people like me are in business, and we sort of try to help them understand that and navigate that, and you know, give them some advice about how to do that. So political stability is a very, very important factor for them. But, you know, at the end of the day, the other really important thing is going to be their the various economic incentives. And so one of the things that we've encouraged everybody to think about is, look, all of these countries that I mentioned are now have been affected by the COVID-19, Vietnam and Thailand a little bit less. But they're all very, very eager now to attract foreign investment. They're all putting in place various new investment incentives. So the smart companies are those that try to play these countries off against each other and find what is, you know, what are the best combination of incentives. Things like land, you know, can they get free land? Can they get free electricity hookups so they don't have to spend a lot in terms of infrastructure? What kind of tax incentives can they get over, you know, 5 or 10 years or more? What kind of incentives can they get for training local labor? So these are all things that make a huge difference for a company. And if we can help them to negotiate those and, again, play them off against each other. So a country like Indonesia, even though they're not as attractive as Vietnam, they have said point blank that they will match or exceed any incentive that Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia offer to American companies. So that's a powerful incentive to try to see what we can do to help them and get the very best possible deals that they can. And Indonesia, you know, unlike let's say Thailand or Malaysia, which do have a little bit of political instability, Indonesia actually has had a very strong democracy since the 1998 Asian financial crisis, when the then you know, General Suharto, who had been in power for 30 years, he fell, and Indonesia took a really brave decision that in retrospect seems even more brave, which was they decided that instead of just allowing the military to take over, that they would organize the first free and fair elections in Indonesia, which they did. And that was a pretty big risk at the time. And people didn't really fully appreciate the magnitude of what they were doing. And that turned out to really pay off for them. And you've seen, again, political stability, but also on the economic side, they really began to institute, the best market reforms and benchmarked those against what the IMF and the World Bank were advising, and put in place some very, very solid macroeconomic policies. And as a result of that, you've really seen terrific political and economic stability in Indonesia. They do have these problems of the ease of doing business and so forth, because it's such a big and complicated place. But the political stability matters because, again, you're a big company like Procter and Gamble and investing hundreds of millions of dollars in diaper factories. You want to be able to know that, you're going to be able to continue to produce and market those and maybe even export. So all of those factors matter.
Historically, there's certainly been lots of examples where the goal of democracy conflicts with that goal of political stability. Thinking of Guatemala, let's say in the 50s, where there was Tommy Corcoran, was the Washington wheeler dealer who was part of the coup in Guatemala, and when it failed, he said, the problem was we put in the wrong thug, right? And I wonder. But it's interesting because you also say, like, if you go, there's a risk that two authoritarian countries of protests now, which could destabilize the authoritarian regime. So I guess,
right.
Can you kind of just, it seems interesting to me. Maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. Well, again, I think there are degrees of risk, right? So in a place like Thailand, which for many, many years, was a relatively strong and open democracy, to then sort of be reversed and have first a military government and now sort of quasi-military government. Once the people of Thailand had a taste of real democracy, they don't want to go back. They want to continue to enjoy all those benefits of democracy, and they don't like the fact that these authoritarian governments tend to be less transparent and certainly less accountable to the people. And so when you see the middle class growing in these countries, many of them have lived overseas, they've studied overseas, and they've seen how democracy is supposed to operate. And they come back and they have very high expectations of their leaders and of their various institutions. And so the question is, at what point do those frustrations sort of start to boil over and reach a tipping point and become a real problem? And that's often difficult to judge. I've been in situations, I was, again, going back to my South and Central Asia experience, one of the countries that we had a lot of headaches with was Kyrgyzstan, believe it or not. Kyrgyzstan, which is located next to China and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and was a relatively moderate and open country, but had been run by a dictator for many, many years. And people were just sort of chafing at that. And believe it or not, the government raised electricity prices. And that was enough of a spark to cause demonstrations first in the rural areas, which then spread to the urban areas, and then spread to not just dissatisfaction with electricity, but dissatisfaction with the government. The government acted as they often do by overreacting, and they started shooting demonstrators, and that just made things worse. To make a long story short, within a week, this guy, a guy called Bakiev, was gone. And he fled to Belarus, never to return. And we, the United States, helped to organize elections there. And I don't want to say it's perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. And so, my point being, it's very, very unpredictable. What is going to be a sort of combustible mix of issues that's going to cause people to finally say enough's enough. And that's why we emphasize that, democracy is important, and not just democracy, not just elections, but all of the institutions of democracy are important. So having, a fair and just legal system that people can count on, having a real a free press so that people can express their frustrations through a free press, having the ability for people to form non-governmental organizations that will take up a lot of their grievances and actually work on them. All of those are just as important to a functioning democracy as elections. And oftentimes, authoritarian leaders will kind of make that mistake and sort of begin to crack down on those things. And over time, that just breeds discontent and dissatisfaction, particularly in countries where they've had a taste of democracy and now they're seeing their rights being once again in some way circumvented or diminished. And so, it does lead to unpredictability, and it was one of our core talking points when we were diplomats about why democracy was important and why it was in countries' interests to foster greater democratization. Obviously, they weren't going to do it all right away, but to start a gradual process. And one of the problems now is that the Trump administration just has not been as active promoting this. And so you see, for example, President Trump has been had quite an admiring relationship with President Duterte of the Philippines, who is famously embarked on this drug war with thousands and thousands of extrajudicial killings of suspected drug smugglers. Without any kind of due process. People are just rounded up and they're killed and off they go. And there have been other problems with democracy in the Philippines. And without the United States to advocate, nobody else really has the same clout that we do. The European Union is a much more clumsy and slow institution to react to a lot of these things. And without the United States as sort of a companion, they haven't had as much influence. And again, you have the Chinese who at this very same time are pushing their own much more authoritarian model and giving encouragement to people like President Duterte and Prime Minister Prayut in Thailand. So it's a much more difficult environment now in which to promote democracy. And again, at a very time when we need those institutions, the institutions like the UN Human Rights Councils themselves have been weakened. And you see countries like China itself joining those institutions as a way of preventing greater activism on the part of these organizations. So again, US leadership really matters on these issues. And the lack of US leadership over the last 4 years has had an impact.
Do you think, just getting toward the end here of our conversation, but do you think that China eventually will go sort of on a path maybe similar to what happened in the 80s in Eastern Europe, that eventually this will, they'll have to democratize in some insignificant ways, or do you think they'll be able to hold this together for?
Well, I don't know. Eventually, it's always.
And no one really predicted it would happen.
Exactly. I mean, I don't. Let's put it this way. I don't think anybody is predicting that President Xi is going to change his own thinking anytime soon. So as long as he's in power, you're gonna see this model continue. The counter argument, of course, is that Chinese themselves are going to start to demand more, and you do see that beginning. So in my spare time, I actually do a lot of work on environmental issues, and one of the things that we've noticed is that we always think of the Chinese government as being unresponsive to the concerns of its citizens. That's actually not true. They're extremely careful and very, very conscious of what the needs and concerns of their citizens are. And a good example of that is on environmental issues, where people are local Chinese citizens are very concerned about the air that their children are breathing, the polluted water that they're drinking, So there's been a tremendous pressure on the part of Chinese citizens on their government to improve environmental policies. And that's in part why you've seen a much more aggressive approach on things like climate change by the Chinese than you might have expected. But also, you know, progress on things like toxic waste, because they are conscious that they need to do more in this area, and they want to be a great power, and they understand that they need to make progress on these issues. So I think that there are pockets where you can see that there is some semblance of democracy, but in other areas that are going to threaten the overall control of the Chinese Communist Party, like opening up the internet, it's hard to imagine them making big changes. And I will say, you know, Bill, we talked earlier about efficiency. This does have an impact on efficiency, because one of the advantages of having a democracy and a free market is that it helps you to make better allocation decisions. And the private sector is always going to be more productive on these kinds of things. And when you have the government making these decisions, particularly through state-owned enterprises, you see a lot of corruption and you see a lot of bad decisions. So they tend to throw a lot of money at things like artificial intelligence that is not terribly well directed, and a lot of it gets wasted. And, you know, again, I think people in China recognize that and are frustrated by that. So there's always underneath the surface in China that sort of brewing discontent. I don't want to say that I'm an expert on China. I'm not, but I went to China several times when I was assistant secretary, because China was such an important country for all of the countries in South Asia and all the countries in Central Asia. So we felt it was really important to engage them and to listen to them and try to, you know, figure out ways where we might be able to cooperate with each other. And, you know, in some cases we did have common interests. So for example, on things like terrorism, we were able to do some work together. But in other areas, you know, they were not interested to talk about democracy and working together to improve democracy in Central Asia. They fundamentally disagreed with what we were doing. And they, on the contrary, felt that we were pushing policies that would potentially cause the overthrow of some of these dictators, which actually did happen. But that, you know, it actually was in many ways a good thing, because it led to a more accountable and democratic system in a place like the Kyrgyz Republic.
There's a question. The question is why would China favor for Biden in this election? There's been reports that, and of course there's reports of Russia, of course, obviously favoring Trump. But it sounds like China could benefit in certain ways from a Biden administration, but not in other ways. And I've touched on that in different parts of it. Maybe you could summarize that.
So as you all know, I mean, the administration has been on the attack, particularly in the last year, against China. You know, they closed the consulate in Houston. They have sanctioned Chinese companies and officials for activities in Xinjiang. They have Secretary Pompeo made quite an important speech for the first time, saying that Chinese claims in the South China Sea are unlawful, which went further than others. And there have been the two recent executive orders against TikTok and WeChat. So this is really, you know, they are really, again, sort of doubling down on these efforts. And I think that a Biden administration would be a little bit more, would try to kind of figure out how to work with China. In other words, they'd probably think, okay, we should try to figure out a relationship that allows for healthy competition, but also allows for tough measures when appropriate to call out Chinese policies and behaviors that we disagree with. And then we need to, you know, coordinate with them on shared challenges, like climate change, like Iran, like coronavirus. And that whole coordination side of it has just been completely missing. And I think that hurts. Again, I work a lot on climate change, and there's the momentum on climate change has just completely disappeared in many cases. The EU is doing quite a lot, but without the leadership of the United States and without the example of the United States, it kind of gives many countries around the world a pass to not do as much and to sort of say, well, you know, if the America's not going to do anything, why should we do anything? And so I think having, if the two largest, most influential countries in the world, the United States and China, can work together and figure out what's important to them, they can make an immense difference on things like climate change. And we've sort of lost that opportunity. But we should also, as I said, be very clear-eyed about where the challenges are. And there are many in China. And we need to, most of all, I think we need to have our own policies to figure out how to improve our own competitiveness. And again, it goes back to more research, more spending on government research, again, improving our own infrastructure, including our digital infrastructure, and again, attracting the most talented people in the world to come to the United States and conduct their research and make sure that the Nobel Prizes that are awarded every year are mostly go to people who are based in America, whatever their nationality might be, which has traditionally been the case.
Well, thank you. I think we've just about run out of time. I want to again, thank you for this very interesting discussion and a really interesting perspective on how all of these different issues fit together, from the focused questions about businesses making decisions to these broad questions of geopolitics. And I think it's a great advertisement of the kind of work that you do, but also the kind of work that the World Affairs Council tries to do in terms of getting people to understand the big picture and these applications. So,
Bill, can I just make a short advertisement for the State Department and the Foreign Service?
Sure.
You know, there's been a lot of bad press about the State Department recently, and but if there are any young people who are listening today, or the parents of young people, I really want people to think about a career in the State Department as a Foreign Service officer. I spent 31 years doing this work, and I really can honestly say I don't think there's any more interesting work that can be done. If you want to both serve your country and make a difference almost every day of your life, helping people in one way or another, whether you're an economic officer helping American businesses to sell more or to solve problems that they might be experiencing in various countries, whether you're a political officer working on human rights and religious freedom and democracy in various parts of the world, whether you're a guy working or person working on public diplomacy, explaining America's policies and why we do what we do. It's just a wonderful, wonderful career. They take good care of you, and you know, yes, the State Department has been kind of sidelined in the current administration, but that is really a departure of 50 years of bipartisan support for what the State Department does. And even though the Trump administration has repeatedly tried to cut the budget of the State Department, Congress has always restored it because they believe in the mission of the State Department. And we believe in the importance of American leadership in the world. And I think if there's a Biden administration or a future Republican administration, we'll go back to that same bilateral, bipartisan consensus that we've always had about the importance of American leadership. And so there's no greater way for young Americans to make a difference than to go and join the State Department. I really, if there's anybody who's interested or would like to know more about it, Rob and Kim and others, please give them my email, and I'm happy to talk to anybody and try to encourage them, because it was a wonderful life, and I loved every minute of it. But also, again, you can make a tremendous difference, and you know, individuals do matter, and individuals can make a difference. And because you have the full weight of the U.S. government behind you, you can get a lot done.
Well, it'll encourage you to know that despite all of this politics of the last few years, I see students, some of our top students every year at Clemson, and I know at other schools all across the country, they're still very idealistic, and they still want to make a difference, and the State Department is something that's still very attractive
Great.
to them. So,
Well, again, I'd be happy to do something. Whenever I go to something like this normally, and I travel to, let's say, Greenville, South Carolina, I always go to talk to whatever the big university is, and I almost always do a session on the State Department and for people who are interested in sort of foreign policy career. So I'd be happy to do a Zoom call with Clemson if there's any interest.
I would be happy to arrange that, and I would say on our World Affairs Council board, we have representatives from USC Upstate and Furman also. So I'll certainly
okay.
let them, if they're not in the audience now, know that offers there too, and maybe we can do something all together. Well, thank you again, and we hope to see you in person down here in Upstate South Carolina real soon. Before we go, just want to announce our next event, the World Affairs Council. Thanks for joining us today, and our next online event is a very different event. You may have this expertise as well, Ambassador Blake, but it's a cooking event on August 26th at noon. Sally Gillespie from Plate 108 will explore the flavors of Eastern Mediterranean cuisine. What could be bad? So if you want to register for that, please visit the upstateinternational.org website. So it gives you a sense of the wide range of things that Upstate that the Upstate International and the World Affairs Council do. So again, it was great to meet you virtually, and it was really enjoyable. I know everybody will agree with me in saying it was a great presentation and a really interesting conversation, and a great perspective on a lot of important issues. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Bye-bye.